There are so many of us committed to improving the lives of the youth in our communities. The In It for Youth podcast is a place for us to come together, from professionals who work with and serve youth to those that champion issues affecting children, to community advocates and stakeholders, and insightful young minds too. The In It for Youth podcast is a tapestry of voices united by a dedication to youth well-being and empowering the young generations of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Jamie Gale, and I'm so glad you've joined me on this team that is in it for youth. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is really special because my guest today is an amazing woman who has been a colleague of mine for many years and also a friend. And our topic today is one of the things I am most passionate about in my work, playful movement. Joining me for this conversation is Mia Hicks. Mia is currently a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison studying bilingual education. She is especially interested in early childhood education and how language, play, and race are woven into kids' learning experiences. Prior to starting this chapter of her training, Mia was a public school classroom teacher for 7 years, working in the dual language immersion program in Madison Metropolitan School District. And she taught kids yoga for over 7 years, serving as a lead instructor and director of inclusion and outreach for Little Ohm Big Ohm, which is how I know her. This is one of my work programs, and I was so lucky to have Mia on my team for so long before she's moved on into these big new roles that she has at UW. Mia is passionate about supporting students to express themselves and to understand and navigate emotions and feelings. Congratulations on all of your impact on youth well-being, Mia, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh my gosh, thank you. That was such a nice introduction.
We were talking before about how it's so nice to have a reason to be back chatting. It's been a few months, and so it's really exciting to have this time carved out together.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here.
So let's start with your current work, your current training, the program that you're doing. Can you fill listeners in on what you're up to these days?
Yes, so I just finished my second year of my PhD program at UW. And so I am finally done with my full-time coursework. And in the past 2 years, I've been really lucky to be doing some research related to literacy, so looking at children's literature, how they use Spanish, as well as being able to go into a classroom and do some research around an anti-racist social studies curriculum. So that's really exciting. And I'm kind of in this phase of in between where I'm starting to look into my own research and trying to develop what I want to study. And so I'm really interested in looking at how social emotional learning is taught and understood within a Spanish bilingual program.
That's really cool. So what comes next in the program for people that aren't familiar with your type of PhD program? What does it look like? What's up next?
Yeah. So I'm in the School of Education, specifically in the Department of Curriculum Instruction. So I know each department's different, but next up will be my preliminary exams, which sounds scary, but it's basically answering 2 questions in a written format that are related to what I want to study. I like to think of it as it's like, okay, kind of an exam to show that you do know enough about a topic to get started on your research.
Cool. So what do the first 2 years look like? You said coursework, but I know you were in a bunch of schools as well. So what did that involve?
Yeah, so my second year, I was supervisor of elementary ed cohort. So it's undergrads that are becoming student teachers. And so it was really cool. It was great to be able to go back into school. So I would go and observe them in their classroom placements and then lead a weekly seminar with them. And so they, graduated last week and they're all on their path and moving forward. So that's been really exciting, especially when I get to go into kindergarten classrooms, because that's where I mostly taught.
And speaking of that, can you fill us in on what led you to this point? Tell us about your teaching experience and what your career looked like before starting the PhD program.
Yeah, so I like to joke that I'm like a three-peat badger because I did my undergrad here and then my master's and then now my PhD. So I taught for 1 year back in my hometown in Illinois, and then I moved here and I taught at one school in the dual language immersion program. It's a program where half the day is instruction in Spanish and half the day is instruction in English. And so I taught in that many years. I just started to notice just some things that I couldn't really place, but I was like, this just feels off a little bit. Half of the students are Spanish speakers, half are learning English. And even though there was this, half and half divide, it just felt like English was still being the dominant language. And with COVID, I noticed, especially when we came back, there wasn't as much room for play and social emotional learning. And in kindergarten, that's such a big deal. And so I kind of had always thought about getting my PhD, but it was after COVID that I realized that, this is a good point for me to go back and start to do some research around these things that I noticed. And of course, I was teaching kids yoga as well, which was wonderful. And yeah.
I was thinking back to how we met, and it was at a training, right? At a kids yoga teacher training. And we met there, and very quickly it was clear we were going to work together. And
yes,
we met each other sort of towards the beginning of Little Om Big Om. And so you really were such a huge part of its growth and reaching so many kids. And I also just, of course, had so much fun working with you. So,
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I had a really good time. And, I was really sad to leave, but now I've got all these little projects going on and trying to manage that all. So, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was just wonderful to have a space that was purely about joy, movement, emotions, all of that good stuff.
I think that's a really good tee up to talk about what Little Om Big Om is, because I actually don't think I've spoken about it much on this podcast yet. So Little Om Big Om is a kids yoga program where teachers like Mia and me and the rest of the team go into anywhere that there are kids to teach yoga and mindfulness to kids and families. I always say, like, if there are adults in the room, it's because there are kids in the room. So we don't do any just adult classes with,
Yes.
mats and rows and music and no talking. It's all very playful, very developmentally appropriate, kid-based. And so we are teaching in schools and camps and after school programs and libraries and community centers and doing triathlon warm-ups, and basically anywhere there are kids, we can turn it into a kids yoga studio. So I'm curious, did any of those experiences like really stand out to you, or like what were some of the memorable moments from over the years? I know there was so many hundreds, maybe probably thousands of classes that you taught.
Yeah, I mean, it was just always so fun when people would ask me like, "Oh, what studio are you at?" I was like, "Well, that's the beauty. My studio, I have all the mats in my car with me. I can go anywhere." And so I love being able to just show up somewhere and bring yoga to kids. I think the family yoga was really fun to see, especially throughout the whole session, and just seeing families play together and kind of just drop this like feeling of, in some other sports or activities where it's very like, this is how we do things. And yoga, it's like, hey, we're all here to have fun. We're moving our bodies and it's okay if it's different. And it was just always fun when you saw that realization in kids or families. However I move my body can be mindful movement. I think my favorite thing to be part of was Creative Soul Camp. And so being a part of the camp where there was all of this creativity happening and seeing all these kids through different ages, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, Mia was for so many years. So Creative Soul Camp is a collaborative creative arts enrichment camp that we have summer day camps and then after school programs. And so the kids get all different types of creative arts programming all right there. And so Mia was the one teaching the kids yoga for so many years at camp. And I think you played more games of Night at the Museum there than most people would be able to tolerate. So
yes, that was a crowd pleaser. Every kid always loved that
game. And I apparently didn't ever play it right, because if I ever had to sub for one of your classes, I was told that I did not do it right. So you were the queen of that game for sure. So
that's so funny.
So this is a really perfect lead up. We're going to talk today about playful movement. And you already mentioned how our kids yoga programming is just totally about play, and it's not about perfect poses, and it's about the way you move your body. And so I want to just start with, like, what are we even talking about when we talk about playful movement? Because I think those are obviously words that we use all the time when we're talking to kids, but what we're talking about is something kind of specific. So how would you define what it is that we're even talking about when we address this topic?
That's a great question. I think the beauty of play is that it can be thought of in so many different ways. And I think of playful movement as kind of this in-between of creativity and freeness with your body, but also recognizing how it affects you or how it affects people around you. It can be specific, but I think each person might look at it a little differently. But I do think, I think there's the marriage between the two of moving your body, but also noticing, how does it make me feel on the inside? And that awareness, I think, is very key.
Yeah, and doing it in a way that isn't performance based, that you can show people what you're doing in a playful movement. And so in that sense, you could put on a little play to show people what you're doing, but it's not necessarily results driven, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not for a grade. It's not for a final score. It's not to win a game. It's movement for the sake of enjoying it. And like you said,
Yep.
learning about yourself and what's happening around you. And so obviously in our kids yoga classes, that was the main focus, but that can look like so many different things. So I'd love to just spend a few minutes talking about what are the range of ways that people can explore playful movement. So what does this look like, let's say in a school?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you said that it's not for a purpose or a grade, because I think many times kids and especially adults come in thinking I need to perform or I need to do it a certain way. If I think about adult yoga classes, and
Mm-hmm.
even though I know this in my head, it's so hard not to just like model it, look exactly like the
Totally.
teacher. And so I think what the beauty of, especially with early childhood and in schools, is that kids are really just doing play to enjoy themselves. And so I actually did my master's thesis on how play can enact so many literacy practices. I mean, obviously play is so important for social emotional learning, but when kids tell stories and they act it out, that's an example of play that also is academic in a sense. We have tangible objects that they can use to play with, but also this like imaginary where they might take something and use it in a different way. And I think, in our yoga classes, sometimes we would like make up a yoga story and then we would add in motions or movements to match a word in the story. And so I just think of how much creativity these little ones and big ones have. And I think sometimes in school it gets pushed to the side. I mean, definitely does. And I think in early childhood, especially with that foundation, allowing them to do this playful movement and to be creative just for themselves and just for joy is so important.
Especially as, even if you take sports, which is obviously not in school, and I know I'm going against my question I asked about the school, but in sports, kids younger and younger, with how many programs are being developed to help kids learn more about different things, it's so well intended, right? Soccer programs that are developed for younger and younger ages, or even dance, that the focus dance can be so playful, but then it can be so sort of pigeonholed into the
Hmm.
exact final result of something. And as that becomes more and more common, the like playing outside on the playground, the open-ended play becomes less and less. And so I really think as much as we can to loop it back to the school topic, or in classrooms, any formal education programs, to allow kids to loop that playful movement back in, because they might not be getting it as much outside of school as they used to.
Yeah.
And then I think that the flip side of that is that it's not just the younger kids. I think that,
Yes.
right? Like when you think of preschool, it's really easy to convince someone like, oh, in early childhood, like, yeah, give kids a lot of time to play. One, because the kids are not going to sit for longer,
Right. Yeah.
But then when you kind of get into that upper elementary ages, kids are able to sit, or many kids are able to sit for longer, but that doesn't mean that we should be having kids sit for longer. And I was thinking about how at the training I went to once, they were talking about how kids are spending more and more time in chairs at younger and younger ages, and how that actually affects their physical development, like the growth
Oh,
of certain
wow.
areas of their
Yeah.
body. Like even like think about your hamstrings, you're not stretching them as much. And so those muscles are going to be shortened. And obviously our tech posture, all of that. And so when you're allowing kids to be playful, physically playful, it can reduce the impact of the amount of time they're sitting in chairs.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love that you brought up the older grades, because my experience teaching was mostly in early childhood, but I sub when I can. And I've done a lot of subbing in fourth and fifth grade. And at first I was like, I'm not sure how to interact with these kids, but I was like, no, like everybody has a kindergartner inside of them. And so seeing what kind of playfulness they have and things like that, I think it's really important to point out that play should still be allowed in fifth grade.
Well, and I was thinking of, was it 2 summers ago? We were at camp at Creative Soul Camp, and you were teaching the kids yoga. And some of the weeks of camp, we have a tween camp as well. So that's kids 10 to 14. And so the general like plan is that we're not going to be singing our little kiddie songs in the tween classes. And it's going to look a little bit more like an adult yoga class, but there's still some play involved, but not necessarily playfulness. And they asked to sing the little kid song, the
Yes,
little kid
I
opening
remember
song,
that.
and they were
Yes.
just singing their hearts out. And so sort of creating that space to give them permission to even And there is something about movement that like loosens people up and allows for them to relax in that way and to allow themselves to be playful. So that was just a cute little memory about exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah.
So, okay, you have studied this about what the impact of play has on the literacy and the academic learning. And so I'm really curious if you can kind of fill us in on what was that research like and what did you find and what is the sales pitch for educators to be incorporating more play?
I always joke that I would have an extended playtime in my classroom, and if anyone questioned it, I would just print my thesis out and stick it on my door and say, refer to my thesis. And yeah, I think the work that I did, I looked into, of course, we know that playtime has really shrunk a lot in classrooms. My master's was pre-COVID, but after COVID, I even know when we first went back, there was this fear like we can't share toys or anything. And I think that almost set up this kind of perfect storm for, oh, well, let's take these toys away and, they're not going to come back. But before COVID, playtime was definitely dwindling. But then I started to notice, specifically with a few of my kids who maybe might be labeled as quiet or shy or maybe not showing what they know, we'd be in playtime and we would have been like in literacy time learning about kind of like beginning, middle, end of stories or character or plot. And they would be playing and I would notice like, oh, they're demonstrating this whatever Common Core standard. I was like, they're showing it right now. And so, I was reading about play and literacy and I kind of was like, well, I'm reading similar things in both spheres. So why don't we try to put it together? And I didn't tell the students like, hey, we're going to do literacy during play. It just kind of naturally happened. And so I'd ask them like, do you want to come tell me a story about what you're doing or can I sit here? And so they would tell me these stories. And I think even at some point, like they would introduce characters from the book that we had read like the day before. And I think it just really opened my eyes. I think like to think I'm open-minded. And so, I know there's multiple different ways to participate in learning, but I thought, oh, this kid maybe isn't as interested in literacy. He's really into math, but then this really showed me a whole new side of him. And then I was able to share it with his parents. And, I think they had been used to kind of hearing things like he kicked someone today or something like that. And I was like, hey, like I actually is an inspiration for my master's, and so yeah, and so sometimes when I'm subbing I still see some of those students and it just brings a smile to my face that they taught me about how big play can be.
As we're kind of digging into this topic, I'm thinking about it's really for me, and I'm assuming for you, because this is just the work we've been so invested in, that movement has always been tied to play in our minds. Like movement is playful to us, and when I'm really thinking about it, it is the two pieces of it. And so what could we tell a teacher who's like, I get the movement piece, like, okay, we could do, we could move our bodies in the room. Yeah. And then you get the teacher who's like, okay, the playful piece, like I'm a playful person, I'm goofy, whatever that is. But where could an educator who's like, okay, I'm bought in, how could they start to integrate the play with the movement? Let's just say in a classroom, because I think that's probably the hardest one to wrap your head around.
Yeah, well, I think of when I'm subbing or when I'm still in schools, I see a lot of times for like mindfulness breaks or like they'll put on, a YouTube video or something like that. And it's still being guided where like students are expected to follow this. There's a well-intentioned of it's a body break. There's something called Go Doodle, and those are really fun too. But I think one tangible thing I can think of is asking kids like when we did the yoga stories, and it doesn't have to necessarily be yoga, but enacting this storytelling, which, you can find standards that it's going to hit, but then letting the kids do the movements and add in that. And I think being goofy and playful is also wonderful to build relationships with students. And then they feel a little more vulnerable and open and willing to share themselves with you. So I think literacy, I'm really into literacy too. You can't tell. It creates so much space for these kinds of things. But I think, yeah, I love the idea of mindfulness in the classroom and things, but I wonder if teachers could start to let students lead that. And so that they feel more invested in it as well.
Yeah. So I was chatting with one of my friends and colleagues, Edward DeShazer, on his podcast, Teachers Ed. If you haven't heard it before, listeners, you should check it out. It's really wonderful. And we were actually talking about yoga and mindfulness in the classroom and talking about some of the same things that you and I are talking about right now. And he brought up a really good point that, my experience in schools is always as the outside person coming in to bring these tools. And I'm not responsible for the academic learning in the same way as the classroom teachers. And he brought up a really interesting point about how classroom teachers can sometimes be nervous to let kids start moving in the classroom because things can escalate. And then it's like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get them back settled in and all that? So I would love to hear, I mean, you have so much experience in both arenas, both as the classroom teacher and as someone who comes in with the candy of the fun, not the literal candy, but the
Yeah.
fun, playful
Yeah.
activities. And so what would you tell a teacher who's concerned about bringing movement into their classroom?
Yeah. And I've been in that moment where I'm like, like chaos is going to ensue. I'm going to lose control of the class. And I think that's really where it sits. And if you can reflect on like, why do you feel like you need to control the class? And again, that is so much easier said than done. But even just giving like a little experiment, like what if I did build in 5 minutes where I'm like, okay, let's let the kids like, this is our downtime. It could be like after lunch or something like that, where like you get to do what you want to do. And it can feel really uncomfortable. I know I'm like, oh, it's too loud. It's too loud. And then I'm like, oh, but this loudness is joyful. It's not anyone, screaming or, ripping things off the wall or something like that. And I just think if you give kids more time, if you slow down, then other parts of the day, like they're going to be more ready for. If we think about ourselves, like we need breaks in the day, and not
Totally.
just a break where it's like, okay, go to the bathroom, drink your water, here's a coloring page, but you have to sit quietly, and like there's a time and place for that, but to let them just be themselves. And sometimes it could be easier to start by going outside where they can yell and be goofy and silly and it doesn't feel as overwhelming as in a classroom. But I think allowing students that time, and even if it's a little bit of time, like I think when they see that they're able to do that, like I think it also builds again that relationship where they feel like, wow, this is a community, this is a space where I can be myself and my teacher will still like love me.
And I think that while I'm not coming at it from the classroom teacher's point of view, like I really believe so wholeheartedly that when we give kids practice modulating the energy up and then coming back down, that's such a huge skill that will aid them in learning, but also aid them in life. And,
Yes.
That energy is coming out, right? Like if a kid at some point, and it might be,
Yes.
it might be like in the restraint collapse after school, they're just melting
Yeah.
down. But if we give kids the, when we talk about like the energy in a yoga class, we intentionally practice, like in a kids yoga class, at least bringing the energy up in order to then practice bringing it back down. And so I think that it might be, and I like your suggestion of going outside where that might feel a little less out of control for a teacher, but giving a group of kids, and not just individually, but like as a group, the practice of like, okay, we're going to let things get a little loud and playful and then bringing it back down. And whether that is thinking about what movement is more activating and what is more calming, and practicing it and trialing it out and seeing how it impacts your students can really make such a big difference. It's like regulation on a bigger scale. It's like
Yes.
group regulation. And
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's cliche, but like just simple breathing, reminding kids and adults to simply breathe and practicing the belly breath and just like practicing as a group and then reminding kids. And this is something that as I've stepped out of the classroom, like recognizing like we all have big feelings and sometimes they're going to come out and I might not see something as a big deal, but it might be a big deal for a kid. And so
mm-hmm.
recognizing that, giving them the space, but then also hopefully giving them some tools that they can use, if they feel ready to use, but also not necessarily like, okay, come on, take a big breath. You're going to be fine. Let's keep going. Like that's not helpful.
Mm-mm.
And again, it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
It's really easy to say, but when you're in the moment and there's 18 kids, it is really hard. So a lot of times I would literally turn around and take like the biggest breath of my life
Oh.
before I came back. I'd say, oh my, if something was happening. I learned it from another teacher to regulate myself and to take a big breath because if I'm having a big reaction, I can't tell my students not to have big reactions. So,
mm-hmm. And incorporating playfulness into that can make it, so often, we talk about breathing with kids, for example, to go on what you were talking about, and it becomes, I'm going to use the word like punishment, but that's not what I mean.
right.
But it's
Yes.
like you hear an adult say to a kid, the adult is frustrated, the kid is having a meltdown, and it's almost like you need to take a deep breath. Well, that is I understand the like moment, right? So
Yes.
well as a parent, as a teacher, yeah, you understand how they both got there. But if you can infuse a little playfulness into that, whether that's having them make something move with it, whether it's like pretending they're a dragon blowing hot smoke and allowing their imagination to kick in. And so you are getting to the same goal of whether it is getting their physical energy out, whether it is calming their mind, whether it is lowering the emotional temperature in the room. But if you can infuse playfulness, and I love how you describe how it helps to promote that relationship between the teacher and the child. And then you're going to see kids do it between themselves as well, instead of like a punishment, you have to take a deep breath.
Right.
It's
It's like
like,
we can all take a breath and let's do it, let's do a dragon's breath.
totally, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also it's a good, when sometimes for me, I know, and for kids as well, like when you get such heightened state, you've kind of got to distract yourself. And so being able to move your body and take that big breath, it kind of distracts you. And I don't know how a kid does the dragon breath, their tongue out and doesn't laugh a little. And like that, just
Right.
quick distraction can really help as well.
Right. Or even something as simple as like when we are in a group and we're practicing like gorilla pose, which is a common adult yoga posture. But if you do it in a kids yoga class and you have everybody stand with their backs together and everybody leans forward and looks between their legs at everybody, it's playful. It's joyful. You can't not laugh when you're like
Yeah.
ooh, ah-ahing
Right.
at each other across the circle.
Yeah.
But it's achieving the same physiological benefit as if you were doing it silently with your eyes closed in a dark room in a studio, maybe even more benefit because now you're adding in the benefit of laughter and playfulness.
Yeah. And I think also teachers modeling vulnerability and doing these things with kids, I think is really helpful too. You can put on, cosmic kids yoga, but like if you do it with the kids, like when I would do it with kids, like way more kids would come to the rug. We pretend we were British and stuff like that. And so modeling that playfulness as well, because, sometimes they don't come across a lot of adults that are playful, there's multiple reasons why, but yeah.
And the benefit is that the adult in the room is the teacher now is experiencing playful movement. And even if it was the
Yes.
last thing you wanted to do in that moment, you're going to feel better. You just are going to feel better.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about regulation and the way that I've been kind of talking about it. And I'm curious if you have more to add on it, especially in the context of school, is that when you're talking about, well, a lot of times you hear like, oh, this child is dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it's like, well, what does that mean? Because I feel like, again, that becomes equivalent of like naughty. They're
Yes.
not obedient. I heard this definition that I sort of like have continued to finesse, and I think it really makes sense. And I'm curious if you agree that when you are dysregulated, there is some body process that's getting in the way of what you need to be doing or want to be doing. So it's some physical process, or our emotions are so tied to our body, so it can be an emotional state that's then tied to a physical state. And so when we become regulated, we are able to do what we need to be doing or want to be doing. So I'm just curious if you have a better way to explain that, or like how are you hearing that concept described?
Yeah. I think I love that you said the idea of this obedience, because it's like, we will, when people will say, oh, this kid's really dysregulated. And I'll say like, how many adults do you know that are regulated all the time? And I think it's this idea of like, they're not fitting into like what we expect or want them to do in the moment. And yes, there is the physiological. I'm picturing this image that I've seen of the brain, and there's a part of the brain that is related to this fight or flight notion. When you get so heightened up, you're out of a space where you're able to kind of think in your usual brain. And so, a consequence or punishment, however you want to word it, or trying to talk literally and trying to talk through an emotion with someone at that point, it's not going to work. So I think it's important to kind of recognize, okay, so how can we help them to start to come back into their own space, their own body, and then we can do some thinking together. But a lot of times, we want a quick fix. We have to keep
Mm-hmm.
going when we're teaching. There's not a lot of time in the day, especially in the DLI program, which is why I want to do research into this. With the two languages, the schedule is like really tight, and so there's not always space. And it's hard for some kids that are learning a new language. So there is a lot of dysregulation. I'm like, hey, like, I am with you. Like, I'm exhausted. My brain it's hard. And so I think just recognizing that, even just taking a couple of seconds to pause before you respond to a kid that you feel is dysregulated, I think can make a really big impact. But yeah, I think you explained it perfectly. I don't think I could do any better.
Well, and it's like that concept that an escalated adult cannot de-escalate a child. And so it kind of starts with you and doing what you need to do. And again, this is where practicing playful movement outside of those moments will give you so much better access to the tools in the moment when
Yes.
you're using the part of your brain that's in fight or flight. And then you can incorporate some movement. You might not feel very playful in that
Yeah.
moment, but you will have those tools, those strategies. They will feel like well-worn grooves. You can return to them. And the child, even if they aren't, again, feeling very playful in the moment, they will have practiced that. They will be able to better access that as they get closer to using the parts of the brain that can help them make, decisions that are going along with what is safe in the moment or appropriate behavior in the moment and making responsible decisions. And then here is where, like you are mentioning the breath. We've been talking about movement, and then using those tools can help to calm the mind, which is exactly what we're referencing. So I mean, it's so worth it. I don't have I'm going to just post your thesis next time.
Yeah. And I will say, like, it's not every day and every time it might not work. You have to keep trying. And I think you mentioned practicing beforehand. To borrow from literacy, there's this thing called the gradual release of responsibility, or GER. And you start off as the I do, where the teacher models, and then it's a we do, where then you all practice together, and then the you do. And then that's when students are kind of scaffolded to do it on their own. So something that we would do in kindergarten is we had a peace place where whenever a student wanted to, sometimes we would ask them to go, but any student could just get up and go when they needed it, as a place to kind of check in with themselves. But I would practice, I would go over there, and then each student would take a turn going, and then we would all talk about how it felt. And that way it wasn't, like a punishment when someone
Right.
did go over there, but it was like, this is here for you if you'd like it. Some kids, would go over there and it'd be like, okay, like, you got to come back now, because they had they really liked that downtime. And not every kid liked it, but it was important for us to model. And I think that's something, in teaching, but also, even if you're not a teacher, anyone that's working with kids, like modeling for kids is huge.
And yeah, I love that you took turns practicing going in the corner, because it's just like that, you can read about driving a car for forever and ever, but until you slam on your brakes for the first time, you don't know what that feels like. And that's on my mind right now because my middle child, Aaron, just got his driver's license. So
Oh,
he
that's
just
so
turned 16 and just started
exciting.
driving. But yeah, I love that you had them practice it, because then it did take away the pun. It wasn't a timeout, and it was a tool, a skill that they could be familiar with it. It wasn't an unknown sensation to be in that corner of the room. So I really love that.
Yeah, we put a picture of an island, and then we had a little thing they could trace, and like pictures there. And yeah, it was great. And even I would also model if I was frustrated or scared or super excited. I would say, like, oh my, I'm feeling a little frustrated right now. Or you're like, oh, like, wow, a surprise fire alarm. Wow, that really scared me. Like, that made my
Mm,
heart race. And some kids are like, oh, you were scared too. I'm like, yeah, and it's okay.
hmm hmm I love that. And it just brings your work focuses a lot, as I mentioned earlier, like in emotional acceptance and acknowledgement. And so when you as the teacher can model that you are experiencing the full range of emotions as well, it opens that up for kids. It makes it normal. It makes it healthy. We should be experiencing the range of emotions. That's how we know we're doing it
Yes.
right, And so I really love that. So I think that the key is, I'm thinking about what are the overarching points as we kind of think about a teacher who has felt like they need to keep, quote, control over their group and is feeling like, okay, I know I want to be incorporating play, but I don't necessarily trust myself to do it, or I don't trust the kids to do it. Basically, to start with little movement, even if it is structured movement, allowing play within the structure, like you were mentioning the yoga story where everybody adds a motion to the story, and start with something small. Trust that with practice that your group, your class will learn to bring the energy back down, and
Hmm.
that know that doing this practice will impact the, quote, bottom line of the classroom, the actual academic goals. What
Hmm.
am I missing?
Relationship building. I think when there's
Yes.
this community feeling, people feel more open to try these things. And also, like, it's not going to work overnight. you may try something, you're like, oh no, that is not like fidgets in my classroom. No, they did not work. It did not work out, like the little whatever, it just wasn't it. And I think also having conversations with students. So we talk about like, okay, do we feel like these fidgets are actually helping us? And kids will be like, it's really
Mm,
colorful and it is kind of a toy. And I'm
mm-hmm,
like, okay, so maybe
mm-hmm.
we put these away. But I think even like just especially with older kids as well, having these conversations, like what does play mean to you? Do we think this helps? Like trying things out and then coming back together. I mean, like, how did that feel? It's a great way to get their feedback as well.
And for those older kids, maybe knowing that there's going to be some awkwardness because they
Yeah.
haven't been given the opportunities to be
Yeah.
playful, and
Right.
sort of like helping them through that discomfort of trying something new for the first time in a long time, rather than being like, oh, they don't like it, we're not going to do it. So, yeah, cool. So, what is coming next for you? I know we talked a little bit about what's up next in your program, but your impact on youth is just going to keep cascading bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're so lucky to have you leading
Oh,
the way
thank
in our community in
you.
this way. So
Yeah.
fill us in on like what's next, I guess, in the short term, and what comes like big picture.
Yeah. So once I pass those preliminary exams, I can start to write my research proposal. And then from there, once it's approved, I can actually do my research. So I'd love to be in a DLI classroom looking at how behavior and emotions are taught, how students are experiencing that learning. And eventually, I think my goal has always been to do something that uplifts teachers. When I'm sitting in classes and I'm reading these academic articles written by people that have never taught, I'm like, I know that's not their intention, but they are really placing blame indirectly on teachers. And I think teachers are working within a system and that system is not working. I don't know if it ever
Mm-hmm.
really worked for, majority of kids. And so my goal has always been how can I help teachers because they're working in a system, how they teach is rooted in that system. It's not an individual teacher that's goal is to ruin kids' life. Like that's just,
Right.
a lot of people are like, oh, that's such a bad teacher. And it's like, hey, like even if you spent 3 hours, if you went on a field trip with your kids, like you will learn like teachers are
Yeah.
trying their best. No one's teaching right now if they don't want to teach. They're there because they care. And so I would love to do research that is uplifting teachers and recognizing, the good things that we're seeing and also helping teach them things like this, like stepping out of this classroom for a moment and having space to think about things like behavior and emotion. So yeah, I don't know. I know I kind of went into this thinking I'd like to be a professor and work with, teachers in the field. I really, really like doing the research. So at least 3 more years in my program. So, I'll kind of keep ideas in the back pocket. But for now, my goal is always to help teachers so that they can help students.
Well, I love that so much. And I have no doubt that wherever you land, it will be amazing and so impactful.
Thank you.
I love everything you said. And I could see you advising even like school administration in a way to support the teachers too. I mean, it is a
Yep.
system. And so thank you for on behalf of our whole world for making the impact that you are.
Thank you.
So the last question that I always ask my guests on each episode is if you could wave a magic wand on behalf of kids in 2024, what would you wish for and what messages would you tell them?
Oh, that is a great question. I think the magic wand or what I would wish for kids and even the child that's in all adults as well is like this self-love and this acceptance and awareness of what's going on. I think especially when I think about how I've been working with upper elementary and middle school, like there is so many emotions and hormones
Mhm.
raging and just if everyone, I wish that everyone had space and time to kind of think through what's going on with them and just to give themselves a little bit more love and know that, they're incredible and that they're going to overcome what's going on and that they feel loved and that they have a community and relationships. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I
Thank
love
you.
it.
And obviously world peace, but
Yes, absolutely. 100%. So, do you have anything that our listeners could do to help you and your research? Are there any asks that you would make of our listening community?
I think just having more patience and love for educators and also for if parents that have kids that maybe interact with other kids. I understand that things happen between kids and just maybe having a little bit more patience and awareness that, like we talked about with the dysregulation, like kids aren't just doing things because they want to hurt. Having even a pause to just like think about, what the other kid might be going through or another adult going through. I think that would help with my research, and especially supporting our teachers. There's a lot of changes going on with policies and thinking about what's happened since Act 10 with the teachers unions and stuff like that. Teaching is an incredibly difficult job right now. And I mean, I think it always has been, but especially right now with scrutiny. So just having patience and a little love and, even just like a thank you to a teacher can really go a long way.
I love it. Well, thank you, Mia, so much for being here and for being in it for youth.
Yes, thank you for having me.
If listeners want to reach out to you to learn more about your research or make a connection for you or anything like that, what is the best way that they can reach out to you?
My email address? Yeah.
Okay, we'll link that in the show notes for sure.
Okay, yeah, I'm not that active in my own, I'm not an academic on Twitter or X or Instagram. My Instagram is mostly of dogs because I also work for a pet rescue. So if they want, if they want to look at that and help out with pets, but yeah, feel free to email me. I love talking about this kind of stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining me. And to all the listeners, thank you for being in it for youth. We will be back next time with another inspiring interview. In It for Youth is a Lit Path Studios production. Music is by Inspiring Audio and Pond 5. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And to learn more about this show and all other shows on the network, visit www.litpathstudios.com.